Babylon was not merely a city of laws, kings, and legendary wonders. It was a city where religion reached into every corner of life, into the marketplace, the family, the law, and even the most intimate acts of the human body. Beneath its towering ziggurats and gold-lined temples existed a system so deeply normalized that its cruelty was almost invisible to those who lived within it. A system where devotion and exploitation became indistinguishable. For more than 3,000 years, sexuality in Babylon was not treated as something private or shameful. It was ritualized, organized, and controlled by the temple. What modern readers might instinctively call prostitution was, in Babylon, framed as sacred obligation. It was duty, it was law, it was worship, and for countless women it was destiny. At the heart of the city stood the temples, massive stone structures that dominated the skyline and the psyche of Babylonian life. These were not merely places of prayer. They were economic powerhouses, political centers, and moral authorities. Within their walls, religion was not symbolic. It was operational, and human bodies, especially female bodies, were among its most valuable resources. Women were dedicated to the gods not as symbols, but as offerings. Their lives were organized around ritual schedules, sacred spaces, and laws that defined obedience as holiness. From a young age, many learned that their bodies did not fully belong to them. They belonged to the goddess, to the temple, to a divine system that claimed cosmic necessity as justification. This was not a hidden practice whispered about in shame. It was public, regulated, enforced. Sexual acts were recorded in temple accounts alongside grain, deliveries, and silver payments. What occurred in the shadows of the temple walls was not considered sin, but service. Not abuse, but blessing. And yet, beneath the language of holiness, something far darker took root. A structure that transformed devotion into control, that turned belief into obedience, that allowed power to pass itself off as divine will. Babylon believed it was honoring the gods, but in doing so, it built one of history's longest-lasting systems where religion and sexual exploitation became one, and where the voices of the women at its center were never recorded, never questioned, and never remembered. If Babylon was the machine, then Ishtar was its engine. At the center of the city's religious life stood a goddess unlike any other in the ancient world. Known first as Inanna and later as Ishtar, she embodied contradictions that terrified and fascinated her followers. She was the giver of life and the bringer of death, the patron of love and the architect of war. In Babylonian myth, desire and violence were not opposites. They were inseparable forces, flowing from the same divine source. Stories carved into clay and sung in temple hymns describe Ishtar as impulsive, proud, and merciless. She granted abundance to those who pleased her, and ruin to those who did not. When heroes rejected her advances, cities fell. When kings honored her rituals, their reigns prospered. Her favor was believed to determine the fate of empires. To serve Ishtar was not simply devotion, it was survival. Unlike later religions that demanded moral purity, Ishtar demanded surrender. Her power did not reside in restraint, but in excess. In pleasure taken without apology. In domination celebrated as sacred truth. Babylonian priests taught that the goddess required more than prayers or incense. She demanded participation. The body itself became the altar. Within this belief system, sexuality was not a private act but a cosmic transaction. Each ritual performed in Ishtar's name was believed to echo across the universe, reinforcing the fragile balance between fertility and destruction. To deny the goddess access to human bodies was to invite famine, defeat, and divine wrath. Fear ensured obedience. This theology transformed human desire into religious duty. What men sought, priests sanctioned. What women endured, doctrine glorified. To question the system was to question the goddess herself, a dangerous act in a world where gods were not symbolic, but immediate and cruel. Ishtar's temples stood as monuments to this belief. Their walls glowed with lapis and gold, depicting scenes of conquest and union, victory and submission. Inside, hymns praised the goddess's lovers and celebrated the surrender of flesh as holy offering. Every ritual reinforced the same message. Power flows downward from the divine, and those beneath exist to serve it. In Babylon, violence did not always wear the face of brutality. Sometimes it wore the mask of reverence. And in the name of Ishtar, devotion and domination became indistinguishable, binding the fate of countless women to the will of a goddess who demanded everything and forgave nothing. Inside Ishtar's temples, beyond the public halls of worship, existed a world governed by rules far older than kings. This was the domain of the qadištu, women set apart, renamed and bound to the goddess by law and ritual. Once they crossed the temple threshold, they ceased to exist as daughters, sisters, or future wives. They became sacred property. Most entered this life young. Some were handed over by families crushed by poverty. Others offered as religious devotion in exchange for protection or favor. A girl brought into the temple did not return home at night. She remained within stone walls where time moved according to ritual calendars, not seasons. Her childhood ended quietly without ceremony. Training replaced freedom. The qadištu learned how to move, how to speak, and most importantly, how to obey. Music and dance were taught not as art, but as discipline. Cosmetics and clothing were not expressions of identity, but markers of role. Every gesture carried meaning. Every silence was intentional. The body itself became a language the temple could read and control. Babylonian law reinforced this separation. The qadištu were recognized in legal codes, protected from certain abuses, yet denied the basic choices of ordinary life. They could not marry. They could not bear legitimate children. Their future was written before. They were old enough to understand it. In the eyes of the city, they were holy. In reality, they were trapped. Men who entered Ishtar's temple did not see individuals. They saw vessels of divine access. Offerings were placed on altars, names were recorded by scribes, and rituals proceeded with chilling efficiency. The women's consent was irrelevant. The law had already spoken in the voice of the gods. Obedience was not enforced with chains or whips. It was enforced through belief. From their first days in the temple, the qadištu were taught that refusal was sacrilege, that hesitation invited divine punishment, and that suffering was proof of devotion. Fear and faith became inseparable. Outside the temple walls, Babylon thrived. Markets bustled. Kings ruled. Empires rose and fell. Inside, the qadištu lived lives measured not in years, but in rituals completed and duties fulfilled. Their names appeared in records. Their bodies sustained the system. Their voices, however, were never preserved. And so the law of the gods endured, unchallenged, unquestioned, turning girls into holy instruments and sanctifying a system that mistook control for devotion and silence for consent. By the 5th century BCE, Babylon was no longer an untouched mystery. Merchants, soldiers, and scholars passed through its gates, drawn by its wealth and reputation. Among them was a Greek historian, named Herodotus, a man accustomed to strange customs, yet unprepared for what he witnessed inside the city's most sacred spaces. In his writings, Herodotus described a ritual so disturbing that he labeled it the most shameful custom he had ever encountered. According to his account, every woman born in Babylon was required, once in her lifetime, to enter the sacred enclosure of Ishtar's temple. And wait, there, she would sit among others marked by ritual cords and symbols, unable to leave until a stranger approached and cast a coin toward her. The act that followed was not framed as choice, nor as transaction, but as divine obligation. To Herodotus, the practice was incomprehensible. To Babylonians, it was law. What shocked the Greek observer was not only the ritual itself, but the absence of resistance. Women did not flee. Priests did not hide the practice. The system functioned openly, calmly, and with terrifying certainty. Once the offering was made, refusal was forbidden. The law of the gods had already decided. Modern scholars would later argue over whether Herodotus misunderstood what he saw, whether the ritual applied to all women or only to temple servants. But what matters is this: the practice he described was real enough to be recorded, detailed enough to horrify, and normalized enough to continue unchallenged. Herodotus noted that wealth and status offered no escape. Noble women arrived in covered carriages. Poor women waited in crowded enclosures. Beauty shortened the wait. Age prolonged it. Some women, he claimed, remained within the temple for years before the ritual was fulfilled. Time itself became part of the punishment. For Babylon, this was not cruelty. It was cosmology. The ritual was believed to please Ishtar, to protect the city, to ensure fertility and divine favor. The suffering of individuals was insignificant compared to the balance of the universe. Herodotus left Babylon disturbed, carrying with him a story that would echo across centuries. But the women he described remained behind, bound by law, belief, and silence, participants in a ritual so normalized that only an outsider dared to call it shameful. And in that contrast lies the true horror. Not the ritual itself, but how completely it had become sacred. Centuries after Herodotus left Babylon, his words would become a battleground. Modern scholars questioned his account, arguing that he misunderstood what he saw, that cultural bias led him to mistake professional temple servants for ordinary women, that Greek moral frameworks distorted foreign practices. On the surface, the debate seemed reasonable, but Babylon's own records refused to stay silent. Unlike Greek observations, these records were not written to shock outsiders. They were administrative, routine, cold. Clay tablets recovered from ruined temples list names, dates, offerings, and payments with the precision of an accountant. Silver weighed, grain measured, services recorded. Women identified not by family, but by function. The system did not hide itself. It documented itself. Hammurabi's Code, one of the earliest legal systems in human history, confirms what the tablets imply. Temple women were recognized under law. They were granted certain protections, permitted to own property, and regulated by statutes that define their status. These laws did not liberate them. They formalized their confinement. By naming them, the law fixed them in place. Religious texts reinforce the same reality. Temple hymns openly praise Ishtar's servants, celebrating their role in maintaining divine favor. These are not metaphors or symbolic abstractions. The language is direct, physical, and unmistakable. The body is central. Desire is sacred. Service is expected. Taken together, the evidence forms a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. This was not a misunderstanding imposed by foreign observers. It was an institution created, maintained, and justified from within Babylonian society itself. Greek writers may have reacted with horror, but the machinery they described was already ancient by the time they arrived. The debate, then, is not about whether sacred temple sexuality existed. It did. The real question is how it functioned, who benefited from it, and whose voices were excluded from the record. The tablets speak clearly, but only for the system. They tell us what was counted, regulated, and preserved. They do not tell us what it felt like to live inside it. And that absence matters. Because while scholars argue over interpretation, the clay remains unbroken. The names are still there. The payments are still listed. The hymns still praise obedience. Babylon left behind a paper trail of belief turned into bureaucracy, proof that devotion was not only spiritual but operational. Herodotus may have been an outsider, but the tablets belong to Babylon, and they carry a weight that no debate can erase. By the time Babylon reached its height, the temples were no longer just places of worship. They were economic empires. Vast estates stretched beyond the city walls. Workshops produced textiles, metal goods, and ritual objects. Herds grazed on temple-owned land. Storehouses overflowed with grain. And deep within sacred complexes, treasuries glittered with silver and gold. This wealth did not appear by accident. It was engineered, Sacred sexuality formed one of the temple's most reliable sources of income. Babylon sat at the crossroads of trade routes, drawing merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and travelers from across the ancient world. Many arrived seeking profit. Others sought protection, and countless men sought the favor of Ishtar. The temple offered all three, at a price. Offerings flowed steadily into the sacred coffers. Coins were weighed, goods were tallied. Scribes recorded each transaction with methodical precision. The language was religious, but the structure was unmistakably commercial. What was framed as devotion functioned as business, and it worked exceptionally well. Priests stood at the center of this system. They controlled access to ritual spaces, interpreted divine will, and managed temple assets. Their authority grew alongside the temple's wealth, reinforcing a hierarchy that blurred the line between spiritual leadership and economic domination. The goddess was invoked at every step, but the benefits accumulated in human hands. The women at the heart of the system received honor in theory. They were called sacred. They were named servants of Ishtar. Their role was praised in hymns and rituals, but honor did not grant control. They did not manage the wealth they generated. They did not shape the laws that governed them. Their bodies sustained the institution, yet they remained excluded from its power. To question this arrangement was to challenge the gods themselves. The temple's prosperity was presented as proof of divine approval. As long as the city flourished, the system was justified. Success silenced doubt. Wealth became evidence of holiness. From the outside, Babylon appeared blessed. Its temples gleamed. Its priests commanded respect. Its rituals promised cosmic balance. But beneath the polished stone and sacred language lay a machine that converted belief into profit and obedience into currency. By turning devotion into revenue, Babylon perfected a model where exploitation could wear the mask of sanctity. The temples grew richer, the priests grew stronger, and the women, essential, honored, and powerless, remained fixed in place, sustaining an empire that called their sacrifice holy. Babylon was not an exception. It was a template. As empires rose and fell across the ancient world, the same pattern appeared again and again. In Phoenician ports, in Cypriot sanctuaries, in the hilltop temples of Corinth, systems strikingly similar to Babylon's took root. Different cities, different goddesses, the same logic. Wherever female deities of fertility, love, and power were worshipped, human bodies became tools of divine economy. This was not coincidence. Sacred sexuality endured because it solved multiple problems at once. Religiously, it provided a tangible way to please the gods, an offering more immediate than grain or incense. Economically, it generated steady wealth for temples that functioned as banks, landlords, and employers. Socially, it regulated desire, directing male behavior into sanctioned spaces while reinforcing strict boundaries for women. Politically, it centralized authority in religious institutions that claimed divine approval for every rule they enforced. The language of holiness made resistance almost impossible. To question the system was not to challenge men or laws, it was to challenge the gods themselves. Female autonomy was framed as dangerous. Submission was framed as sacred. Over time, belief hardened into tradition, and tradition became unquestionable truth. As the practice spread, it adapted. In some regions, temple women served permanently. In others, ordinary women were expected to participate once as a ritual of fertility or civic duty. The details shifted, but the foundation remained the same. Institutions controlled access to the sacred, and women bore the cost of maintaining it. Generations passed under this system. Girls entered temples long before. They understood the role awaiting them. Older women faded quietly from records when their usefulness ended. The system did not need cruelty to survive. It relied on continuity, on repetition, on the slow normalization of control. What made sacred prostitution so resilient was not violence alone, but integration. It became embedded in law, economy, religion, and identity. To remove it would have required dismantling the very structures that held society together. And so it remained unchallenged for centuries, not because it was humane, but because it was effective. Across cultures and borders, the same quiet exchange repeated itself. Obedience traded for belonging, bodies traded for stability, exploitation translated into divine order. Babylon may have perfected the model, but the ancient world embraced it. And as long as institutions benefited, the language of holiness ensured that sacred control would survive, long after the gods themselves faded. From belief, when the temples finally fell silent, what remained was not confession, not apology, and not truth. What remained was absence. The ancient world left behind mountains of evidence, hymns etched into stone, laws pressed into clay, ledgers recording offerings and labor. Names were counted, duties were defined, rituals were preserved. Yet amid all this documentation, one thing is missing entirely: the voices of the women who lived and died within the system. They did not write their own histories. No tablets record their doubts. No hymns preserve their fear. No laws speak of their suffering. What we know of them exists only through the institutions that controlled them, through priests who justified their role, scribes who counted their labor, and rulers who benefited from their obedience. Silence was not accidental. It was structural. As empires collapsed and gods faded from worship, the system itself dissolved quietly. There was no reckoning, no formal end. The women simply disappeared from records as new beliefs replaced old ones. Christianity rose, condemning the very practices it inherited metaphors from. Babylon became a symbol of corruption, even as the human cost of its rituals remained unnamed. This absence is the final violence. To be used, regulated, and sanctified is one form of erasure. To be forgotten entirely is another. History often preserves power with precision and suffering with indifference. The sacred women of Babylon were essential to the functioning of their society, yet disposable to its memory. They sustained the temples, enriched the priests, and upheld cosmic order, only to vanish once their usefulness ended. What this story leaves us with is not certainty, but warning. When religion and authority merge without accountability, exploitation can become ritual, obedience can be praised as holiness, and cruelty can wear the language of necessity. The people inside such systems may never see themselves as victims. Belief can make endurance feel meaningful. Babylon believed it was honoring a goddess. Its rituals promised balance, fertility, and divine favor. But history, looking back through broken temples and unreadable names, reveals something else entirely. A civilization that consumed its women and called it sacred,